A single gnarled willow stump stands in no man's land. It has been there for weeks, perhaps months, blasted by shellfire, stripped of leaves, forgotten by both sides. The German sentries glance at it each morning, confirming its presence as a landmark, a fixture of the desolate landscape between the trenches. But inside that dead tree, barely breathing, crouched in a steel tube no wider than a coffin, sits a British soldier with a periscope and a field telephone. He watches. He counts. He notes the flash of every German gun. And when he relays those coordinates back to his artillery battery, German cannons that have killed hundreds of Allied soldiers simply cease to exist. This is the story of one of the most audacious deceptions of the First World War, a scheme so brazen it sounds like fiction. How did artists, painters, and sculptors become weapons of war? How did fake trees, assembled in secret workshops behind the lines, become instruments of destruction that silenced German artillery from the inside out? By 1914, the Western Front had become a nightmare no one had predicted. The war of movement that generals had planned, the cavalry charges and sweeping advances, had ground to a halt in the mud of Belgium and France. Two vast armies now faced each other across a narrow strip of churned earth, barbed wire, and shell craters. This was no man's land, a place where death came from every direction, where a man who raised his head above the parapet might lose it in an instant. The trenches stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border, nearly 800 kilometers of fortified positions, and neither side could break through. The problem facing military commanders was deceptively simple. To win, you needed to know where the enemy was. You needed to see his artillery positions, his ammunition dumps, his troop movements, his reinforcement routes. But how could you observe when any exposed position drew immediate fire? How could you watch when the slightest movement attracted snipers, when even a periscope, glinting in the sun, could bring down a mortar barrage? If you are finding this journey into military history compelling, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. It helps bring more stories like this to light. Observation was the key to artillery supremacy, and artillery was the god of the battlefield. Whoever could locate enemy guns first could destroy them. Whoever controlled the high ground, or any elevated position, could direct devastating fire onto targets their gunners could not see. Counter-battery fire, the art of using your artillery to destroy enemy artillery, was becoming the most critical discipline of the war. But it required eyes, forward observers who could spot the muzzle flash of an enemy gun, calculate its position, and relay that information back to their own batteries. The French were the first to confront this problem with a solution that seemed almost absurd. In the chaos of early 1915, a painter named Lucien Victor Guiron de Sévola, serving as a second-class gunner in the 6th Artillery Regiment, began experimenting with techniques that would change warfare forever. De Sévola was not a military man by training. He was an artist, a student of Fernand Cormon, a painter associated with the symbolist movement who had exhibited in the salons of Paris. But in the trenches, his artistic eye saw possibilities that military minds had missed. In September 1914, de Sévola had experimented with covering gun emplacements with painted canvas screens, breaking up their outlines, making them harder to spot from the air. It was crude work, improvised with whatever materials were available, but it worked. The concept was not entirely new, of course. Hunters had used camouflage for centuries, and the word itself came from Parisian slang, meaning to disguise or deceive. But the systematic application of camouflage to modern warfare, the creation of an entire military department dedicated to deception, that was revolutionary. General Joffre recognized the value of de Sévola's work. On the 12th of February 1915, he established the Section de Camouflage at Amiens, the first dedicated camouflage unit in military history. De Sévola was given command and told to recruit artists, painters, sculptors, set designers, anyone with the skills to deceive the eye. He quoted the Cubists as his inspiration. To completely distort the aspect of an object, he said, I had to employ the means that Cubists used to represent it. The avant-garde art movement that had scandalized Parisian galleries was now being weaponized for the battlefield. By May 1915, de Scévola's section had produced its first observation tree during the Second Battle of Artois. The concept was breathtakingly simple, yet fiendishly difficult to execute. An observation post that looked exactly like a dead tree, complete with gnarled bark and broken limbs, but was actually a hollow steel cylinder with slits for observation, armored enough to protect the man inside from shrapnel and rifle fire. The observer would climb inside, close the hatch, and watch the enemy through carefully disguised viewing holes covered with wire mesh. He was invisible, protected, and perfectly positioned to direct artillery fire onto German positions. The construction of these trees was an art form unto itself. First, a reconnaissance team would identify a suitable tree in no man's land, preferably one that had already been damaged by shell fire, a dead or dying trunk that would not look out of place in that blasted landscape. Then, under cover of darkness, an artist would crawl into the danger zone to make detailed sketches of the tree. Every broken branch, every strip of peeling bark, every knot and scar had to be recorded with precision. The slightest discrepancy could alert the enemy that something had changed. Sarah Patterson, a historian who has studied these remarkable objects, described the danger of that initial reconnaissance. The tree needed to be bespoke, she explained, because the enemy would be watching and looking for any changes on their front line. Dawn was the very best time to get enough light to make those sketches, but it was a very narrow time window, and the whole process was incredibly dangerous because you could be under enemy observation the whole time. An artist, armed only with pencils and paper, crawling through shell craters and barbed wire to draw a tree while German snipers scanned the landscape. That was the price of creating these deadly illusions. The sketches were rushed back to workshops behind the lines, where teams of craftsmen began constructing the replica. The core was a cylinder of rolled steel, thick enough to stop rifle bullets and shrapnel, narrow enough for a single man to climb inside. Around this armored tube, the artists wrapped sheets of painted iron, shaped and welded to replicate the trunk they had sketched. Some trees used actual strips of bark, carefully sewn or glued to canvas and then wrapped around the steel frame. Plaster, wood, paint, wire mesh, anything that could create the texture and color of a real tree was employed. The result was a masterpiece of deception, a sculpture that looked like nature but was built for war. The French taught the British their techniques, and in December 1915, General Herbert Plumer arranged for a British painter named Solomon Joseph Solomon to visit the front lines and study French methods. Solomon was an unlikely soldier. 55 years old when the war began, he was a founding member of the New English Art Club, a member of the Royal Academy, a portrait painter who had exhibited at the finest galleries in London. He had signed up as a private in the Artists' Rifles, a territorial force regiment, but his mind was already working on ways his artistic skills could serve the war effort. Solomon had been promoting his ideas on camouflage for months, first in the press and then directly to senior army officers. When he finally received permission to visit France and study the French camouflage section, he was already developing plans far more ambitious than painted canvas screens. General Douglas Haig, Commander-in-Chief of British forces in France, was impressed enough to give Solomon the temporary rank of lieutenant colonel and instruct him to establish a British camouflage production unit. On the 31st of December 1915, Solomon was given his orders. His first task would be the construction of armored observation trees. Solomon recruited an artist and sculptor named Leon Underwood, a young man attached to the Royal Engineers camouflage section. Underwood was given what seemed like an impossible mission to find a suitable tree in no man's land near Ypres, make detailed sketches of it, and then build a replica that could fool German observers who had been staring at that same tree for months. The tree he selected was a dead willow, stripped and shattered by shellfire, its trunk split and its branches reduced to jagged stumps. It was perfect, unremarkable, exactly the kind of ruin that dotted no man's land by the thousands. Underwood made his sketches, and the construction began in workshops at the Special Works Park, a secret facility where soldiers who had been artists, sculptors, theatrical set designers, and craftsmen before the war now worked to create the instruments of deception. The replica willow took shape, a hollow steel tower wrapped in camouflaged skin, fitted with a periscope so the observer could see without exposing himself through the viewing slits, equipped with a field telephone so he could relay his observations instantly to the artillery batteries behind the lines. Installing the tree was perhaps the most dangerous part of the entire operation. It had to be done at night, in absolute silence, except for the noise of artillery fire that was deliberately arranged to cover the sounds of the work. A team of engineers would crawl into no man's land, cut down the original tree, dig a hole where the roots had been, and then manhandle the heavy steel replica into position. All of this had to be completed before dawn, and the work site had to be cleared of any evidence that anything had changed. If the Germans noticed fresh soil, sawdust, or footprints, the deception would fail before it had even begun. Solomon himself painted the installation of the first British camouflage tree, and his painting captures the desperate tension of that night. It is almost entirely dark, figures moving like shadows, wrestling with an unwieldy metal object, while shells burst in the distance. The painting is beautiful, but the beauty is terrifying, because every man in that scene knew that discovery meant death. The first British observation tree was successfully installed on the 22nd of March 1916, somewhere along the front lines near Ypres. When dawn broke, the German sentries saw what they always saw, a dead willow stump in no man's land. But now that stump had eyes. Inside, protected by steel, a British observer began his watch, noting every German movement, every supply wagon, every column of troops. Most importantly, he began counting gun flashes, the telltale muzzle blooms that revealed the positions of German artillery batteries. The mathematics of counter-battery fire was precise and deadly. If an observer could accurately fix the position of an enemy gun, if he could measure the bearing and estimate the range, that information could be relayed to British artillery batteries whose guns were already calculated to fire on grid coordinates across the front. Within minutes of spotting a German cannon, British shells could be falling on that exact position. The Germans would never know how their hidden guns had been discovered. They would only know that their artillery was being systematically destroyed by an enemy who seemed to have supernatural vision. If you are still with us on this journey through the hidden innovations of the First World War, take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. More untold stories of military ingenuity are on the way. The value of accurate artillery observation cannot be overstated. According to Harold Hemming, a gunner who served with the British forces, properly positioned observation posts could determine the location of enemy batteries to within 5 yards. Andrew McNaughton, a Canadian artillery officer who would later become one of the most important figures in Canadian military history, placed enormous emphasis on observation post placement. He positioned men himself, teaching them to observe muzzle flashes and immediately send back the angle from their position. With 3 or more observation posts triangulating the same flash, an enemy gun could be located with extraordinary precision even at ranges of 10,000 yards. The observation trees were only one part of a vast system of surveillance that developed along the Western Front. Flash spotting sections were established, manned by soldiers who did nothing but watch for the telltale flicker of distant guns. Sound-ranging units used microphones to detect the boom of artillery fire and triangulate positions through the time differences in sound arrival. Observation balloons floated above the lines, their crews connected by telephone to artillery batteries, directing fire in real time. Aircraft flew overhead, their observers sketching maps and dropping messages to gunners below. But none of these methods offered what the observation trees provided: a protected, concealed, elevated position right in the middle of no man's land, close enough to see details that no balloon or aircraft could capture. The trees quickly evolved beyond simple observation. Some were equipped with sniper rifles, their barrels protruding from carefully disguised slits in the fake bark. A sniper inside an observation tree had almost perfect protection, armored against everything except a direct artillery hit, invisible to the enemy soldiers he was stalking. The psychological effect on German troops was devastating. Men were being killed by shots that seemed to come from nowhere, from a blasted landscape where nothing moved, where every tree stump and shell crater had been studied and memorized. The dead trees were killing them. German commanders eventually became aware that something was wrong. Too many of their guns were being destroyed by counter-battery fire that seemed impossibly accurate. Too many of their soldiers were being picked off by snipers who were never spotted. They began to study the landscape with new suspicion, comparing photographs taken weeks or months apart, looking for any tree that might have changed position or shape. When they finally understood what the French and British were doing, they responded with typical German efficiency. The Germans established their own camouflage sections and began constructing their own observation trees, which they called Baumbeobachter, tree observers. German fake trees were similar in concept to the British and French designs, but reflected German engineering precision. They too selected damaged trees in no man's land, made detailed studies, and constructed armored replicas. They too covered viewing holes with wire mesh and installed field telephones for communication, and they too began using these trees to direct devastating artillery fire onto Allied positions. One of the best documented German observation trees was captured by Australian forces during the Battle of Messines in June 1917. The tree had stood in Oost Tavern Wood, a shattered forest in Belgium, serving as an observation post for the German 3rd Division. When the Australians overran the position, they found the steel tree still standing, its fake bark painted to match the shell-blasted trunks around it. Soldiers from the 3rd Division signed their names on the tree, scratching initials into the metal or writing with pencil on the painted surface. It became a trophy, a souvenir of one of the most unusual weapons of the war. Among the names scratched onto that German tree was Private Frederick Augustus Peck. 3 months after he inscribed his name, Peck was killed in battle. His signature remains on the tree to this day, preserved at the Australian War Memorial, a poignant reminder that behind every military innovation, every clever deception, there were human beings whose lives hung in the balance. The construction and installation of camouflage trees was extraordinarily dangerous work. The men of the Special Works Park who built the trees were craftsmen, not combat soldiers, but they faced the same risks as any frontline unit. At least 15 camoufleurs were killed while installing observation trees, caught by shellfire or sniper bullets while working in the darkness of no man's land. For every successful installation, there were near misses, trees damaged during transport, operations canceled because of unexpected artillery barrages, men wounded or killed before the replica could be put in place. The British ultimately installed approximately 45 observation trees along the Western Front, a relatively small number given the enormous length of the front lines. At least 6 of these were destroyed by German shellfire, either discovered through careful observation or simply hit by random bombardment. From July 1916 onward, the British military began placing greater emphasis on camouflaging gun positions rather than creating new observation posts. This shift suggests that while the trees were valuable, their limitations were becoming apparent. They were difficult to construct, dangerous to install, and vulnerable once discovered. But their legacy far outstripped their numbers. The observation trees proved that artists could be warriors, that creativity and imagination had a place on the battlefield alongside courage and firepower. The techniques developed by desolate, Solomon, and their teams of painters and sculptors laid the foundation for military camouflage as a discipline. What began with painted canvas screens and fake trees evolved into the elaborate deception operations of the Second World War, the inflatable tanks and dummy airfields that fooled German intelligence before D-Day, the ghost armies that drew enemy forces away from real invasion beaches. The trees also demonstrated the terrifying intimacy of trench warfare. These were not weapons that killed from a distance impersonally through the random mathematics of artillery trajectories. The observer in the tree could see the faces of the men he was condemning to death. He watched them walk, eat, carry supplies, repair trenches, all the mundane activities of soldiers trying to survive. And then he picked up his telephone and spoke coordinates that would bring shells crashing down on those same men, tearing apart the positions he had been studying for hours or days. It was personal in a way that most killing in industrial warfare was not. The camouflage sections expanded far beyond trees as the war continued. Workshops that had started building a few observation posts were soon producing thousands of items, camouflage nets to hide artillery batteries, dummy guns to draw enemy fire away from real positions, fake tanks and aircraft, entire dummy trenches constructed to confuse aerial reconnaissance. The Special Works Park employed not just soldiers, but French civilians, men and women who worked alongside the camoufleurs to manufacture the materials of deception on an industrial scale. Artillery guns were hidden in thatched cottages, their barrels protruding through what appeared to be chimney openings. Armored vehicles disappeared under netting woven with strips of painted fabric that blended with the surrounding terrain. Railroad lines were built that went nowhere, drawing German bombers away from the real rail junctions that supplied the front. Haystacks that looked like any other haystacks concealed machine gun positions or observation posts. The entire landscape of the Western Front became a stage set, a vast theatrical production designed to deceive the enemy about where forces were concentrated and where attacks might come. Solomon became increasingly obsessed with camouflage netting as the war progressed. He argued with growing frustration that the Germans were hiding entire armies under vast nets that Allied reconnaissance could not penetrate. He doubted that tanks could be effectively camouflaged because of their large shadows, but believed that properly deployed netting could conceal almost anything. His insistence bordered on paranoia, and his ideas were often dismissed by senior officers who thought he was seeing phantoms. But he was not entirely wrong. Camouflage netting would become standard military equipment used extensively in every major conflict since the First World War. The psychological impact of the observation trees extended beyond their tactical value. German soldiers who learned of the fake trees began to distrust everything they saw. Was that dead trunk really dead? Or was it watching them? Was that shell crater just a hole in the ground? Or did it conceal a British sniper? The landscape itself had become the enemy, a terrain that could not be trusted, where death might hide behind any seemingly innocent feature. This uncertainty wore on morale, added to the stress of living under constant artillery bombardment, and contributed to the general atmosphere of horror that characterized life in the trenches. The trees also raised questions about the nature of war and the role of deception in combat. For centuries, soldiers had taken pride in facing their enemies openly, in courage displayed on the battlefield. The observation trees represented something different, a willingness to deceive, to hide, to strike without warning from concealment. Some soldiers found this troubling, a departure from the warrior traditions they had been raised to respect. Others saw it simply as practical adaptation to a new kind of warfare, a conflict where exposure meant death and survival required cunning as much as courage. The French camouflage section that D'Esquivela commanded eventually employed thousands of workers, including many of the most talented artists in France. André Mare, a specialist in camouflaging lookout posts, was among the Cubist painters who brought their avant-garde techniques to military deception. Jean-Louis Forain, a famous illustrator, served as inspector general. Set painters and stage decorators from the Paris theaters found that their skills in creating convincing illusions translated perfectly to the business of concealing guns and soldiers. The war had created an unlikely alliance between art and death. We are approaching the end of this exploration into the hidden weapons of the First World War. If you have found value in this story, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share with others who appreciate the untold chapters of military history. After the war, Solomon published a book titled Strategic Camouflage, arguing for the continued importance of concealment and deception in military operations. The book received critical derision in England, where many felt that the war was over and its techniques should be forgotten. But German newspapers expressed some support for his ideas, recognizing that the British artist had understood something fundamental about modern warfare. Visibility was vulnerability. The side that could see without being seen held an enormous advantage. The camouflage trees themselves became museum pieces, relics of a war that had killed millions and changed the world forever. The Imperial War Museum in London displays a British observation tree in its First World War galleries, a pollarded willow replica that once stood in no man's land, watching German positions. The tree was acquired by the museum in 1918, and it remains one of the most unusual items in the collection. Visitors can see the steel core, the wrapped sheets of painted iron, the plaster and wood that created the bark-like texture. They can imagine the soldier who once crouched inside, peering through the viewing slits, telephone in hand, ready to call down death on the enemy. The Australian War Memorial displayed the German Bombebachter, captured at Oostdaverner Wood during the centenary. Commemorations of the First World War. The tree still bears the signatures of the Australian soldiers who captured it, including the name of Private Peck, who did not live to see the war's end. These artifacts serve as reminders that war is not just about grand strategies and sweeping battles, but also about individual acts of courage, ingenuity, and desperation. The observation trees were, in a sense, the ancestor of every modern surveillance technology used in warfare today. The principle remains the same: to see without being seen, to gather information that can be used to direct lethal force with precision. From satellite imagery to drone surveillance, from night vision devices to radar systems, the military continues to invest enormous resources in the ability to observe enemy forces while remaining hidden. The fake trees of 1915 and 1916 were primitive by modern standards, but they embodied the same fundamental insight that knowledge is power, and concealed observation is the key to targeting. The men who built and installed these trees were pioneers, though few of them are remembered today. D'Esquivela returned to painting after the war, though his military service earned him the Legion of Honor. Solomon continued advocating for camouflage, but never received the recognition he believed he deserved. Leon Underwood, who sketched that first British observation tree and helped build its replica, went on to become a noted sculptor and teacher. The craftsmen and artists who worked in the workshops, the engineers who crawled through no man's land to cut down real trees and install fake ones, the observers who spent hours and days inside those steel tubes watching and waiting, most of their names are lost to history. But their invention changed warfare forever. The camouflage tree was a small thing in the vast carnage of the First World War, a footnote in a conflict that consumed empires and killed millions. Yet it represented something larger, the recognition that modern war required new ways of thinking, new techniques that merged art and science, creativity, and destruction. The painters and sculptors who built those trees were not warriors in any traditional sense, but they contributed to victory as surely as any infantry regiment. The German artillery that was destroyed by observers in fake trees never knew what had found them. The guns fell silent, their crews killed or scattered, their ammunition blown to fragments by shells that seemed to arrive from nowhere, guided by intelligence that came from an invisible source. The dead trees of no man's land had claimed more victims, and the strange, horrible innovation of armored observation posts had proven its worth. When the war finally ended in November 1918, the trenches fell silent, and the fake trees were abandoned where they stood. Some were collected as trophies, shipped home to museums or private collections. Most simply rusted and collapsed, their steel cores corroding, their painted bark peeling away, until they looked no different from the real dead trees that surrounded them. The deception had worked so well that even in death, the fake trees disappeared into the landscape they had been designed to imitate. The First World War was supposed to be the war to end all wars. It was not, of course. Within 20 years, the world would be at war again, and the techniques pioneered in those muddy trenches would be refined and expanded into even more elaborate deceptions. But the observation trees remained a unique innovation, a moment when artists became killers and fake nature became an instrument of real death. They stand as a testament to human ingenuity in the face of horror, the determination to find any advantage, any edge, in a conflict where survival was measured in inches of ground and seconds of warning. The trees that destroyed German artillery from the inside were never truly trees at all. They were steel and plaster and paint, shaped by human hands into forms that nature would never have produced. But they looked like trees, and in war, appearance is often all that matters. The Germans saw dead stumps and ignored them. The observers inside saw everything, every movement, every flash, every target. And from those hidden positions, they reached out across no man's land with the terrible precision of modern artillery, striking down enemies who never knew they were being watched. This was the genius and the horror of the camouflage tree, a weapon that killed not through its own power, but through the information it gathered, an instrument of death disguised as an instrument of nature. In the catalog of First World War innovations alongside the tank and poison gas in the airplane, the fake tree deserves its place. It was smaller than those other inventions, less dramatic, easier to overlook. But for the German gunners whose batteries were systematically destroyed by counter-battery fire they could not understand or prevent, the observation trees were among the deadliest weapons on the Western Front. The observers in those trees watched men die. They called in the coordinates, heard the acknowledgement from the artillery batteries, and then witnessed the shells falling on their targets. They saw the explosions, the chaos, the destruction they had caused. And then they noted the results in their logs, picked up their telephones again, and called in the next target. It was methodical work, precise and deadly, carried out by men who had been artists before the war made them killers. When the war ended and they returned to civilian life, to their paintings and sculptures and stage designs, what did they carry with them? What memories haunted the men who had watched from inside those steel trees? History does not record their nightmares. It records only their innovation, the creation of a weapon that seemed almost magical in its effectiveness, a way of seeing without being seen that gave the Allies a critical edge in the artillery duel that dominated the Western Front. The fake trees that destroyed German artillery from the inside were a triumph of imagination over firepower, proof that in modern war the mind could be as deadly as any weapon. And somewhere in the archives of museums around the world, those trees still stand. Steel cores wrapped in painted metal, plaster bark still clinging to their surfaces. After more than a century, they wait silently for visitors who come to remember a war that changed everything. The observation slits are dark now, the telephones disconnected, the periscopes removed. But if you look closely, you can still see the mesh that covered the viewing holes. Still imagine the eye pressed against that barrier, scanning the devastated landscape for targets. The trees remember. And through them, we remember, too, the strange and terrible ingenuity of men at war, the artists who became soldiers, and the sculptures that became weapons, the fake trees that watched the Western Front and helped to bring it to its end.